Professor Ατζέμογλου, thank you very much for speaking with Καθημερινή.
It's my pleasure, Yanis. Thank you.
I wanted to begin with a couple of questions about the United States. First of all, now that we are a few weeks away from the orderly inauguration of the next president, how well do you assess that the U.S., the institutions of the U.S., but also the free society of the U.S. stood up to the challenge that was Donald Trump? And how optimistic are you that under President Biden, there can be the kinds of deep-seated economic and political reforms that you have often said are needed in the United States?
Look, I mean, Yanis, of course, we have averted a disaster. Who can complain after such a tumultuous term, and when there was the specter of another 4 years of Donald Trump, which could have really fundamentally damaged American institutions and democracy? Now, finally, we have a new administration. Definitely time to rejoice. But not so fast also. There are three problems that I think are very deep-rooted, and the fact that by the smallest of margins, Biden won in a number of states should not blind us to that. First, this is a deeply divided country. And the grievances that have led to Donald Trump's rise should not be ignored. He is an awful politician, brings the worst in people. He is incoherent. All of those are true. But that does not mean that he was not voicing some real concerns and discontent. And the fact that he obtained almost 48% of the vote, despite all of the disaster, means that those grievances are still real. It would be our big mistake to ignore them. Second, I wrote this in 2016 January, actually, not January, sorry, 2016 December. It is a mistake, a common mistake, to think that U.S. has amazing political institutions that can save us from any right-wing populism or bad president. U.S. has some good institutional features, but our institutional system is not very calibrated for checking against exactly the types of people that Trump is an exemplar. The only way you can check those people is by voting them out of office, but as Trump demonstrated, and the next version of Trump, who will be smarter than him, will do much better, you can distort and thwart the vote in this country. You cannot rely on courts. The courts will sometimes do the right thing, but sometimes they won't. You certainly cannot rely on Congress. Imagine what would have happened if, Republicans were controlling both the House and the Senate as we were running into the 2020 elections. And you cannot rely on federal bureaucracy. The way that I wrote it in 2016 was, we are the last defense. As society, we are the last defense against such a power grab, and that remains true. We, as a society, were strong enough via media, via collective action, via people becoming discontented, that mobilized enough of the US population and led to, really miraculously, to a candidate that was excellent in many ways. I mean, I have great respect for Biden. I'm saying that because my next point is going to criticize him to some degree. But I have great respect for Biden. I think he almost was uniquely qualified at bringing many different segments of the US population that were discontented with Trump together under a broad umbrella, and he beautifully led that campaign and kicked Trump out of the White House. But it could have gone very differently. So I think the biggest mistake we can make, and I'm sure I can assure you 80% of intellectuals will make it, is complacency. Oh, see, you know what great wisdom American people have, how good American democracy is working, how good American institutions are because the courts did not listen to Trump's challenges. That's because they were childish and really badly done. The next version will not be like that. And don't forget that, we have one of the most malapportioned systems in the world among democracies, with the Electoral College and the Senate giving so much power to underpopulated areas. I think there are a lot of political problems in this country. And then that brings me to my third point, again, feeding back into the first one about the grievances. This is a critical time for us to tackle the economic fault lines that have generated those those grievances and that create feedbacks with the political problems I have mentioned. But that's where I think the Biden administration is not sufficiently radical. And I don't mean here that the axis is between the moderate and the progressive wing of the party. I don't think the progressive wing of the party has the right diagnosis either. I think we need a higher minimum wage and greater taxation, but that's not going to, suddenly change those grievances. I think we need a much more comprehensive economic restructuring of this country, and that has to start by changing how we use technology, what we do with technology, who controls technology. And those are very important because unless you do such a restructuring, you're not going to be able to create jobs, and especially good jobs. And if you don't do that, those grievances are going to continue.
I wanted to get to those issues of technology and how to redirect it less towards a kind of job-destroying automation and in directions that are more positive for labor. But before we get to that, I wanted to ask you about the role that the economic elite has been playing in the U.S. and whether you're concerned that this kind of elite, which has become much richer at the expense of the rest of the population in the last 30 or 40 years, has become a meaningful factor pushing the country away from more open economic and political institutions, has become an impediment to democracy itself.
Yes, I think it has. In a somewhat more complex way, perhaps than first may meet the eye, the thing that we are used to and makes perfect economic and political sense is something like what James Robinson and I describe in Why Nations Fail in the case of Venice, where you have an economically successful elite who then grabs more power in the parliament and then uses that power to block other people from entering the parliament and from other people having access to the lucrative economic opportunities such as trading, and even creates technological regress. I think the situation in the US is more nuanced in the sense that we do not have a cohesive elite who thinks about, how can I remove the ladder? And we do not have an elite that is so powerful that they can keep down the rest. But we have an elite that has become completely insular. And it's as much a sin of omission as commission. We have an elite that has come to understand the world through its own lenses and thinks that this level of inequality is completely justified. It's best exemplified. If you ask me, 12 years ago, where is the danger for the US? Which part of the elite? I would have said from the financial elites. They are the ones much more like the Venice example. They have their fingers in money and their arms in politics. And we saw during the financial crisis the ugly truth of how powerful they were. It was a travesty. They manipulated the system. They got themselves off. They got to choose the monetary policy, the banking rescue policy, and everything. But I think it's a bigger threat right now, not from them, not from that sort of commission, but exemplified by the Silicon Valley elite, which is the system is working, and we are rich because we are so smart, and we know where technology is going, and we're going to choose technology in our own image, and then the society is going to just follow in its path. I think that is the more threatening thing for the future.
What would it take for the kind of economic restructuring that you are referring to in terms of directing technology in the right direction and not in a job-destroying automation, which seems to be the way it's going now? And you already mentioned that you feel that the Biden administration has not recognized the priority of this. Has any Western politician recognized the priority of this?
Well, look, let me say it, and thank you for asking that, Yanis, and that's exactly the right question. And let me preface it by saying, unfortunately, I don't know. I don't know the answers. I don't know the answers because to such a complex question, it does take a village. We need to work, all of us, together to develop answers, and we haven't been. So I think when I say the Biden administration isn't clued into it, I didn't mean that they don't know the answer. They're not asking the questions. So I think the first step is to ask the questions. And then there are some obvious answers. I think the first step, but a minor step, is to break the power of big tech over society, not just over their sectors, over society. And if you think about it that way, there's already movement within society. People are clamoring for that. And you see one place where that's already happening is the European Union. European Union has been, problematic for many reasons. You live in Greece, you know the dark side of the European Union.
I live in Brussels, actually. So
you live in Brussels. Sorry.
Dark side even better.
But on the other hand, European Union has been at the forefront of understanding, recognizing, and taking action on the excessive power of big tech. That's one step. It's a minor step. It's a first step. Then we have to start thinking about how we can have a broader set of voices on the future of technology, how the government can play a role in, encouraging new technologies, taking their social consequences into account. How can we lead to an awakening of society? Look, let me tell you, and let me make an analogy, which I think will help. The way that I see it, we are like in the 1980s when it comes to climate. So we have a bubbling disaster in the 1980s, the carbon emissions, and we did not admit that problem. There was a lobby from oil companies, coal companies, energy companies, businesses that denied the problem, and there was no understanding of the problem within society. So the first step was to ask the right questions. But it was slowly in the course of the 1980s and then in the 1990s that an awareness started. Government started taking actions to reduce pollutants in general and fossil fuels, and then we started developing renewable energy sources. Some countries introduced carbon taxes. So it was a process, and it required a much better measurement. We had to understand which are the ones that are creating problems. Is it just oil? Well, it actually turns out coal is even worse. Methane is even worse. So, we had to do all of these measurements. So I think we are in that situation. We first have to have a government awakening together with a societal awakening, and then we have to get into the details of how is it that we can use AI, for example, for good rather than bad. And that means for good when it comes to the economy, for job creation, human productivity, human enrichment, as much as human, not instead of just job replacement, job destruction. How can we use AI for better political discourse? Not, the social media model of Facebook. How can we use AI for individuals to take better control of their lives rather than governments or companies monitoring and manipulating individuals? I think those are fundamental questions. And, it isn't that nobody is asking them. There are people who are raising these issues. There are people who are worried about facial recognition software or the government or the power of Facebook and Google over individuals, but it is still a fringe issue.
And you mentioned the EU as an entity that's moving in the right direction on realizing the dangers of big tech and trying to regulate the sector and the bigger companies. And you wrote recently about the necessity of the world developing instead of in a bipolar direction between the US and China, in a quadripolar direction, which one of the poles of which would be the EU. And I wanted to ask you, especially in terms of the issue of technology, which in many ways will determine the future both economically and geopolitically. Are you optimistic that the EU can rise to that challenge, both in terms of political will to act in a unified way, but also in terms of the capacity to act and to become a true third digital power next to the US and China?
I don't know. That's an excellent question, Yanis. I don't know. And look, I don't want to be a naive optimist. There are many things Europe will not do very well. I don't think Europe is in a good position to balance geopolitically China and Russia's power. Europe depends too much on trade and good relations on both of them and doesn't have the strength to stand up to China or Russia, because different member countries are going to have different economic interests that are going to go in different directions. But in the area of big tech, I think the Europeans have the right instincts, partly because they don't have the leading digital companies. Look, it's a blessing in disguise for Europe. If there was one of Google, Amazon, Facebook, Netflix was in Europe, then perhaps European regulators would be more captured by them. The fact that they are not. But then, there is no guarantee that their regulations are going to be effective. GDPR, I think, on privacy, was exactly the right set of priorities, protect privacy, because that's where a lot of problems start. But it didn't work. It was not an effective regulation. So I don't know whether the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Acts are going to be more effective. Are they ideal? No, I would have done them differently. But I think they are going in the right direction, and they're coming out of the right set of concerns.
Now, another power that the EU has had some frictions with, especially this past year, has been Turkey. And we've seen President Erdogan being increasingly assertive in his foreign policy, even though he's facing continued economic woes at home. What is your sense about the future of the Turkish economy? Can it meaningfully recover and be put on a more sound footing if there isn't significant liberalization of its politics and less control of it by the office of the president?
Well, look, first of all, on the Turkey-EU relations, I think the problem started long before. I think it's actually a clear parallel to what I said about China and Russia. European Union doesn't have the structure to deal with countries that create divergent interests among the member countries. So I don't think President Erdogan has changed his behavior, tremendously over the last 4 years. He did misbehave in various ways, but Germany wanted to sweeten the deal for Erdogan because of the immigration migrants issue. So those same problems are exhibiting themselves, and I don't think that you can hope European Union to fix Turkey's problems. Turkey's problems are domestic, and it has to fix them itself. And I have been very consistent over the last decade or so in saying that the main problem in Turkey are political, are institutional. So Turkey has to choose to fix its economic institutions, and the only way of fixing its economic institutions is to improve its political institutions. So we are very much now at the beginning of the end for a variety of international reasons: cheap money, possibility of of foreign investors pouring in because they didn't really care about what was going on in Turkey, and they didn't have very good options. Turkey could postpone the inevitable, the economic inefficiencies building up, and now they have come with a vengeance. The COVID-19 crisis has hit Turkey very badly. It was high unemployment already, and people are suffering. The balance sheets of banks and companies are in a very bad situation. Foreign capital is increasingly less willing to come. So I think all of those are creating severe problems in Turkey, and I don't think there is an easy solution. I think there has to be a multi-pronged approach. Economic liberalization. I don't like the word economic liberalization. It's not like you're going to open the markets, but it's just legal reform, get rid of the government involvement in companies for political reasons, improve the transparency and corruption situation. But most importantly, the legal and business environment, especially for foreign firms, but also for domestic firms, is not very appetizing in Turkey right now. But those are medium-term measures. They're not going to save the Turkish economy. They need to be coupled with short-term measures to deal with the macroeconomy, to deal with firms' balance sheets, banks' balance sheets. For that, you need foreign capital, because Turkey does not have, Turkey has enough resources for going on in its current path for a couple more months, but it doesn't have enough resources to sort of fix the balance sheets of banks, households, and firms. So it's a very dire situation, and it does require really comprehensive action. On the positive side, Turkey has a lot of potential. It's still a young, very entrepreneurial country. It has good connections in terms of technology, foreign companies, and so on with the outside world. There's a huge market. It's a growing market because of its demographics. So I think there are a lot of things going in favor of Turkey, but it hasn't really made use of them.
Right. Let me ask you, you also mentioned China earlier, and I wanted to tie that into your more recent work with Professor Robinson, The Narrow Corridor. Do you share the concern of those who argue that the age of AI is more and more conducive to what you have referred to as the despotic Leviathan? Cannot in a condition of total surveillance, cannot a state respond to the needs of the citizens without really giving them a voice?
Absolutely, yes. I am very worried about that. And I'm worried about that in several dimensions. First of all, yes, in terms of the balance between state and society, which is at the heart of the narrow corridor, the advent of digital technologies, which many in the early 2000s first viewed as a democratizing force, turned out to be a force that strengthens states, because the more resources you have, the better you are, and for everything like Tor that can protect you against snooping, there are thousands of technologies that are going to make states much more powerful against you. Second, a basic pillar of the narrow corridor and why nations fail is that there are limits to what type of economic growth, especially productivity growth, technological developments, you can have under a despotic system. It does not engender the right type of experimentation, creative energy, innovation, etc. And data does not nullify that conclusion, but it makes it more nuanced. Many top researchers in the United States would love to go and work with the Chinese government, and are completely happy to close their eyes to the abuses of human rights and blatant disregard to privacy and so on. Why? Because they are craving data. And in Europe, for the good reasons that we talked about, there are going to be many barriers on how much data you can use and how you can use data. In the US, not as much as Europe, but there are increasingly limits on that. In China, there are none. So that data abundance is going to create some advantages for China going forward as well. Now, I remain convinced that a fully despotic regime even if empowered by vast amounts of data, is still not a viable model for economic growth in the long run. But it has become much more nuanced than, say, when we wrote it in Why Nations Fail in 2010, 2011.
Okay, and a final question. We are still living through this unprecedented period of the pandemic, which has been a global event with dire health effects, but also major economic consequences. If you were to look 5 or more years ahead, what do you think will be its most lasting economic sort of legacy?
Great question. Yeah, and I don't know. I don't know because, well, first of all, it's impossible to know. But more importantly, I view the current environment as what James Robinson and I called a critical juncture in Why Nations Fail. There is a realization that existing institutions aren't up to snuff. They aren't good enough. But where we are going to go is quite uncertain. Again, go back to our beginning discussion of the US. A few things different, and the US could have now been the beginning of the second term of the Trump presidency and the complete dismantling of free media and democracy.
45,000 votes.
45,000 votes in some states, yes. Where will the Britain be? Out of Europe with a hard Brexit? How will the Conservative Party, the Tories, going to make themselves? Unclear. Where will Mexico be? Brazil be? Russia be? I think there are a lot of questions out there. The hope is that because COVID has accelerated many of the fault lines and the problems that existed, this is an awakening for us. And then we start thinking about, how we can build a better democracy, a better social welfare state, better redistribution of resources. At the center of that, as I have argued, and we mentioned briefly, has to be a redirection of technology. What we do with technology for jobs, what we do with technology for government snooping, what we do for technology for privacy, social media, and all of those things. So we have to rethink all of those. And there is room for us to do that. It's not an impossible task, but it's not an easy task either. But we can go in many, many different directions. We can continue with business as usual. I think that would have been the easiest thing to do for many countries, and it still is. We can empower big tech and Silicon Valley type reasoning and technology control even more. That will create more inequality, more job replacement, more technological solution to social problems that are not working. We can even start emulating China and clamp down on free media and democracy. That could have happened also very easily if Trump had won a second term. So all of those are possibilities. And I think it is going to be a critical time for the collective action of the people to have a first order effect. In the US, we have seen one silver lining to all this cloudy situation. People did turn out in great numbers. They resisted and succeeded in stopping Trump's agenda. Are we going to see the same thing in the UK? Not likely, because the situation is not as bad. There are more other divisions, and the British democracy is not in danger right now. But actually, not realizing that there are deep problems is part of the deep problem. So in some sense, the US may have been lucky that we had the Trump shock and we woke up, and now we're actually aware that we have to do something. A realization that perhaps is not as clear in Britain or in some other parts of the Western world. So I think there are many, many issues we have to sort of grapple with. And I don't think in any of them we can rely on the wisdom of elites or the benevolence and omnipotence of our institutions. We have to take action ourselves.
Professor, thank you very much.
Thank you, Yanis. It was great talking to you.